You're the most influential influencer in vulnerability management. You have put CISA KEV on the map.
Well, I think I'm the second largest non-government contributor. I understood how to connect the dots of like technical concepts with marketing concepts. And CISA's mandate was more federally scoped. A lot of us didn't understand that when it first came out.
Are you seeing changes in terms of attack vectors for vulnerabilities that are getting exploited from an attacker's point of view?
I think the FBI actually was like, hey, we're going to go pop some of these machines and remove shells from Exchange servers.
The rate of exploitation is increasing, and all I read about is funding wars.
I think you have to consider is there's geopolitics, there's multiple administrations going on.
So one of the things I did in my previous job was not on roadmap. And we are not going to do this.
26% that I calculated of vulnerabilities with exploitation evidence for the first time publicly were the disclosure of the exploitation evidence was on the same day or prior to the vulnerability being disclosed. In Europe, the new Cyber Resilience Act actually requires vulnerabilities to disclose exploitation within, I think it's 24 hours of it happening.
What do you think happens to the future of CISA KEV? You have to think that the matter is this exploitable by AI or is it not exploitable by AI?
I don't disagree with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Patrick Garrity, vulnerability researcher at Vulnrichment.
Patrick, it is so nice to have you on this interview series, Noise to Signal. You're the most influential influencer in vulnerability management. You have led marketing teams in the past. You have led vulnerability research teams in the past. You are a vulnerability researcher. You have put CISA KEV on the map, both literally and figuratively, with your periodic table for CISA KEV. You write about CISA KEV all the time. And the thing I find interesting is you are a vulnerability researcher, but not a classical vulnerability researcher, in the sense that you're not finding 0 days exploits, but you have more of an analytical bent in your analysis of vulnerabilities. So I'm curious to understand, like, what got you into vulnerability research? Like, what happened there?
Yeah, kind of crazy. So I started my career in tech. I was working for MSP, and then I got involved in cybersecurity startups in 2012 at Duo Security. And I ended up leading the sales engineering team there. So I have a somewhat technical background in implementing and working with customers and deploying technologies. Back then, it was the first cloud product most people had deployed. And a lot of fun. But, as I gravitated over the years, I did a lot of different roles and ended up doing a lot of product marketing and marketing types of things. And as I went from kind of like a technical implementation role into more product marketing and marketing, naturally, I understood how to connect the dots of like technical concepts with marketing concepts, if that makes sense. And so I ended up in a position being a VP of marketing kind of multiple times, VP operations roles, things that manage sales and marketing. And what I discovered when I joined the company I was at last, Nucleus Security, was that what really resonated with people was actually research. Like they wanted to understand real analytical research. They wanted to understand what the data looked like. And, I would go grab the data and it was Excel file, pivot tables, JSON, CSVs, APIs. And those things just don't translate to most people. And so for me, I'm a very visual learner in person.
I see.
And so naturally, what I saw was other industries tend to convert data into visualizations in order to translate so everyone has a better understanding of the data and the research. And so I just started learning how to draw charts by looking at the data.
You got your start before CISA KEV, and I remember you were pushing for CISA KEV changes early on, because you were finding things, maybe it was at your previous role or something, where you were finding vulnerabilities that were getting exploited in the wild, but they were not getting reported as exploited in the wild in CISA KEV. So I believe that you had like a big struggle there that got you into CISA
Yeah.
KEV.
Yeah, so me and Yotam Perkel, good friend of mine, I can't remember the company he was at the time. I naturally was like, oh, CISA KEV is cool. Like, this is a centralized source for exploitation evidence, right?
Hmm.
And that was a federal mandate in the U.S. CISABOD 20, I don't know, 302, maybe something like that. I
I
forget the
remember.
year and the date. But yeah, what was interesting is this was like the first centralized source of vulnerability exploitation data. And, before there was scraps of information, or you had commercial products and vendors that had proprietary information.
Hmm.
But largely there wasn't a whole lot of aggregate information available publicly. And so, first I wanted to visualize. So I created the Mondrian CISA KEV to visualize like the product and vendors that the CISA KEV had.
Hmm.
And then as I was doing my own research, I kept on coming across the other exploited vulnerabilities that were being reported publicly. And I started reporting those to CISA KEV, and they didn't get added to CISA KEV.
I see.
So to me, it was kind of interesting. Some of them did. Some of them got added. Some of them didn't. And there's a multitude of reasons why. But I was more advocating that like CISA KEV is a great initiative. Provides good visibility to defenders. Like, let's make it complete.
Hmm.
Um, and I think sometimes when you have your interests of trying to make contributions as a researcher, um, there's reasons why and why not they want to curate a list a certain way. I think in CISA's mandate, in particular, it had to have a fix, and it was more federally scoped. And I think
Hmm.
a lot of us didn't understand that when it first came out.
See.
Um, and generally, I think a lot of us wanted it to be the single source for exploitation data, but the reality is it's got a defined scope. It's limited. It's a great resource, but it didn't quite have uh, all the exploitation evidence. There wasn't much evidence referring where it came from,
Hmm.
and that was more of like what we started poking at and challenging was, what exactly is the criteria to get
Yes.
a vulnerability being exploited onto CISA's known exploited vulnerability catalog.
And
Um,
that is very interesting, because before, if I remember correctly, before CISA KEV, there was no catalog of known exploitable vulnerabilities. I mean, as a vendor, you always gravitated towards, is an exploit available, you know, from the metasploits of the world and the immunity and core impacts of the world. That was the extent of which people knew about a vulnerability. They had no insight into what is the state of active exploitation of this vulnerability in the wild. You might have you might have vulnerabilities that are getting discussed in the news, but there is no real good sense of which vulnerabilities are actively used by ransomware threat actors. I mean, obviously there were some feeds and whatnot, but
there was a few smaller disparate sources.
yeah,
Shadow Server is a great public source for exploitation data, where they have honeypots. There was Google Project Zero, which was disclosing their own
yeah,
discoveries,
yeah, but they're
which was
disclosed
really
a lot.
impactful. Like most of those ended up on CISA KEV. So, but like still defined scope. And
Yeah.
then vendor advisories, there's a lot of exploitation that was being disclosed via like Microsoft MSRC, some of the advisories from different product companies. But no one was really like collecting this outside of commercial vendors, including the one I work for, Vulncheck, was doing this and selling it commercially before I even joined.
Mm,
And so you had more of where people were purchasing or buying this would be like a Mandiant or recorded future, but generally the data was like limited to just an indicator saying like, hey, this is known exploited. There was no actual evidence. um and so that was and has been historically a challenge of like having a place to get that information. And then there is one other interesting one, which is Catalan from Risky Business, who previously has been a journalist for Bleeping Computer and a bunch of other ones. His Twitter feed, a lot of people I've interviewed actually were using that as their tip.
Wow.
So literally that Twitter feed, people would insert it into their, SimSor automation tooling. And that would be an indicator of like, if Caitlin talked about it, there's a good probability that it's, being exploited. Not all of them, but like I have manually audited almost all of his articles he's ever wrote. But that was the extent of like how you would get exploitation evidence.
Yeah.
Prior to more recently.
So weird. Even like, I agree with you with respect to the MSRC, the Google project, the Google Zero project as well. It was just mostly finding vulnerabilities, not giving you evidence of exploitation. Maybe sometimes they had evidence of exploitation, but I don't remember having it like, widely accepted as the signal for exploitation. So CISA KEV was a game changer in that context where, most organizations were struggling with vulnerabilities regardless. So CISA KEV was like a breath of fresh air where you just had to focus on, at least you had to start with these 1,500 or 1,000 vulnerabilities that put there, get these out of your network because these are really bad. They're getting actively exploited and so on. And I always thought for a long period of time, this is a very comprehensive list in terms of the vulnerabilities that are getting exploited in the wild. And the limited scope is not something that people know. It's very focused on the federal side and so on and so forth. And my sense is the true active list of exploited vulnerabilities is way bigger than what CISA KEV says it is. Right?
Yeah. I mean, for context, right? It's, an infinite number of possibilities, but ultimately you have to have detections in some way to figure out, is there something being exploited? You have to have a way to associate that with a product vendor and vulnerability. We do a lot of that work. Like we coordinate with Shadow Server on some of that even. In some cases, like you don't know. And so I think that's a reality, but also, CISA is really focused on U.S. centric federal government, U.S. products, very pervasive. If it's on CISA KEV, certainly it's impactful. You should focus on it. You should make sure it gets fixed fast. But there's just so much other activity going on beyond that. I think today we track like somewhere around 4,500, 4,700 different KEVs. And, I think if you have time to go spin up different services, detection rules, and you look at more places as well, publicly disclosing exploitation, you'll quickly find that, there's a lot more evidence out there that you can find. Whether it's impactful or not, I think is always a great question, but impact can really like it can be different based on which region of the world that you're in and what target technologies are being targeted. A lot of things that are being exploited might be EOL and don't have a patch or just don't have a patch. And so this scope, if you think of software is almost infinite. But yeah, really focusing on, hey, which of these things are being exploited helps people to focus on, what they can make the most impact and reduce risk on now. Which is really, really important from a signal perspective when we're talking about lots and lots of vulnerabilities.
So the last time I looked at it, the official list from CISA KEV was about 1,500 or 1,700, and you're saying that list is close to 4,500. So the delta is around.
Sorry, I'll clarify. Their list is
3,000?
1,500. Yeah, currently what we're looking at a Vulnrichment KEV, which we also provide as a free service. Now, when I joined, Anthony was like, "Hey, should we make our commercial KEV free?" And I was like, "Cool." CEOs never ask that question. I think that's awesome. Like to give out, free indicators with references and all that fun stuff. And so naturally, it was kind of a perfect fit when I came to a Vulncheck of something I had already spent a ton of time researching. But yeah, right now I think we're right around 4,700 CVEs that we've identified and cataloged exploitation evidence for across hundreds of different sources.
And does this include the European, the Asian, or is it still a federal focused, US focused?
No, yeah, anything and everything. So we have disclosures of exploitation from Chinese companies, Japan vulnerability notes, European entities, NIST KEV. NIST KEV is only like 15 CVEs right now. And so I think you have to be very mindful of understanding when someone, says, hey, we have a list of KEVs. Spend the time to understand what's on the list, because like if you only fixed 15 vulnerabilities, you're going to be in trouble. But ultimately, all these sources independently have different vulnerabilities that they're cataloging as being exploited.
I see.
And then sometimes there's crossover where many different places are reporting exploitation. React to Shell would be a good example recently, where like there's this mass exploitation, so everyone sees it.
I see.
Log4j being another example too.
And are you seeing, changes in terms of attack vectors for vulnerabilities that are getting exploited from an attacker's point of view? Is there a, you probably closely monitoring this space for over 5 or 6 years, if I remember it correctly.
Yeah.
You came onto scene around 2019, 2020. I remember like your most viral post was this periodic table for CISA KEV, and it just went crazy from there. But if you look back at your time doing vulnerability research, are you seeing a change in patterns for
Yeah.
quotation?
Yeah, so even prior to me getting into the vulnerability management space, um, really, if you look at the prior decade, most of it was like Internet Explorer, Flash, like desktop application, Word, PDF, that sort of stuff. I was actually really surprised there's a new Adobe Reader KEV just recently. There hasn't been one since like 2023. And so that probably speaks to like Adobe likely did a ton of work on that product to harden it.
Mm.
Maybe operating system improvements as well. But the days I think of like macro, based word exploitation, Flash plugin, Flash being deprecated, great thing for everyone. Internet Explorer getting deprecated. And then now we have Chrome predominantly on the Windows desktop and Mac, and you have some other browsers too. But yeah, a big shift from you know those types of exploits being used to initial access. So network edge devices,
Oh,
internet facing devices, file
VPN.
transfer protocols,
Yeah,
yeah,
VPN.
VPN.
Yeah.
Um, places that are like giving full remote access and a lot of times keys to the kingdom or entry into the enterprise. And that's probably the biggest theme is that's where people are getting hit the hardest. And then change in tactics, like recently, I think in 2023, when we saw Progress move it, that was a shift to smash and grab, where they're targeting file transfer servers, grabbing the information, and then essentially saying, doing extortion, saying, we're going to release all this data if you don't pay us money. And so that was a new technique. I think Scattered Spider did that one. And so certainly there's been some changes and adjustments over the last decade as far as what people are targeting. And one of the things from working at Duo Security for 8 years is I think credential compromise. We just seen it, become so much harder with the advent of multi-factor authentication.
I know
Um,
the funny thing is, when I used to write plugins for Tenable, the Nessus plugins. And obviously we would write plugins for vulnerabilities and so on. The most important plugins were default passwords.
yeah, yeah.
Admin. So, you could write the best exploit and so on and so forth, but the most important and the most critical plugins we wrote were like the default passwords, because that's the easiest way to get in. Once you get in, you have admin access and you can do anything you want. So I know the thing that you're mentioning about Duo, I mean, getting the credentials is probably the best vulnerability that is out there, and it stays there forever if you don't fix it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you see a lot of the manufacturers and products hardened
Yeah.
so they don't have default passwords, or you have to at least reset them the first time you log in. And so I think there's been a lot of maturity and the respective understanding that like credential compromise is a big problem. We still have the problem of like people putting their network management interface on the internet. And CISA has gone great lengths to issue guidance regarding that you shouldn't be putting network configuration access on the
Or
internet.
like all the secrets on GitHub and make it public.
Yeah, yeah. Or vCenter on the internet. I mean, a combination of different things where it's like these things should just not be exposed, and you're opening your attack surface by doing that.
So yeah, you mentioned the Duo when you're initially started at Duo, that's where the initial focus was the credential compromise. And I've also one thing that I've noticed is, I mean, if you look at like the DBIR reports, if you look at the Mandiant reports, vulnerability exploitation was not like at the top of the charts in the initial reports that came out. But
No.
if you look at the recent trends, vulnerability exploitation has now become like the top 3 attack vector to break in.
Yeah. Yeah. So a combination of things, right? Kind of funny, but yeah, I spent the 2012 to 2020 at Duo, and I was running sales engineering, so everything was an IR team pulling us in to deploy Duo because there was a breach.
Mm.
Many large scale breaches. Yahoo, DNC, RNC with the 2016 election. You had Target early on. I think that was in 2013. Then you had Equifax, Starwood, SPG, all your hotel, stuff compromised. It kind of went on and on nonstop, and I ended up being the one to like hop in and deploy Duo to get the people out as quickly as possible because most of it was they had creds. Multi-factor got them out, and then you rotate your passwords and hopefully you're on your way. Um, but yeah, when I then did a short term sim vendor, Blue Mirror, a small business, medium sized business. It was kind of interesting going there because in 2021, the biggest theme I saw was Exchange servers getting popped. I think it was, gosh, what shell was it? Not React to Shell.
Proxy
Not
shell,
not what?
proxy logon,
Oh,
proxy.
proxy login. Sorry, not shell.
Yeah,
But yeah, with proxy login, like the I think the FBI actually was like, hey, we're gonna go pop some of these machines and remove shells from Exchange servers. Like that's how bad it got. And it's like, wow, this dynamic, something's changing fast. And then I took some time off and Log4Shell happened, so I actually wasn't working in security during that time. And when I came back to decide to work at a security company, I was looking at trends and I'm like, something's going on here regarding vulnerabilities and exploitation. And I ended up landing at Nucleus Security. And at the time, this was in 2022, all my friends made fun of me. They're like, who cares about vulnerability management? Like, that's a 2-decade old problem that was solved a long time ago. So that was only like 4 years ago. Where no one cared about this space other than the people that had been in it for a long time. And I think at the time, I remember like looking on LinkedIn, there were only like 500 people with the word vulnerability management in their title in the US on LinkedIn. And so, kind of interesting, but not really a well-maintained established practice other than like really compliance driven at
yeah,
that point.
true. Even
Um,
a lot of compliance-driven vulnerability management, PCI. I think it is the requirement number 12 you have to do in vulnerability
yeah,
scan, and that's what
yeah, that
drives
was. So that's
also.
always a sign when you're seeing like change in market and then you see compliance. It's like, okay, something's going on here. And yeah, the M-Trends report came out in 2023 and they're like, well, the number one attack vector, something of that nature is exploitation of vulnerabilities. And everyone kind of doubted it. And I was like, no, like I worked with eyesight partners. I worked with Mandy when I was Duo. They're like on the largest incidents in the world. So, probably worth paying some attention here. And it wasn't until a year later that the DBRI came out that they're like, hey, we see like a 180 or 200% increase in initial access exploitation as well.
Interesting.
And so, 2023, 2024, I spent, or 2022, 2023, while I was spending time at Nucleus, like this kind of rapidly evolved, accelerated quickly. And right before then is when CISA KEV came out with their catalog. So, I mean, kudos to the CISA for kind of, foreseeing some aspect of this coming and being like, hey, we need to make a central list so people understand what things they need to fix and prioritize. Because as we kind of mentioned before, that just wasn't the case. That people had an easy, accessible list of known exploited vulnerabilities before that.
I want to transition to a topic which is a segue into a different topic. Like if you notice the speed of exploitation, the rate of exploitation is increasing, right? And you would imagine the CISA KEVs of the world would get more funding to do their work to support this effort. And all I read about is funding wars. NVIDIA's losing funding. MITRE, there was a MITRE scare around losing funding. I just just last week, NVIDIA lost its funding all over again. I'm curious what you think about that. I mean, these things then they have been on and off. Where
Yeah.
wars
I mean,
have
it's kind of an unfortunate time too. So, if I break it down, like the funding issues really started in 2024, and so one of the things I think you have to consider is there's geopolitics through multiple administrations going on. And so you got to consider that factor. I'll talk about that in a second. But also my observation is there's like politics between agencies historically relating to CISA KEV, CISA funding the CVE program, MITRE runs the CVE program, and then NIST NBD. And I think generally speaking, like there's some aspect of doing similar work in competing interests. That's just a reality. And so in 2024, we had VulnCon, and right around that time, it was in March, right before February. In February, NIST MBD just stopped enriching all CVE records. Like, just stopped. Like, everyone's like, hey, anyone know why for 2 weeks NIST hasn't enriched a single CVE record? Like, this is a federal government agency that's been doing this for like 20 years, right? And suddenly, like, that data just goes away. And so there's a lot of questions. And so we had VulnCon, and NIST came to the table and said, like, hey, yeah, we had funding issues. We lost funding, right? You can do your own research if you want to like see who that points back to, but that kind of speaks to sometimes interagency like politics maybe or funding issues. And naturally they came out and were like, don't worry about it. We got it covered. We'll have the whole backlog covered by September at the latest, or maybe July. I don't know. That never happened. They just, kept on having issues from an enrichment perspective. They finally got back to like some baseline, but at the same time, then CIS is like, we're going to start this other experimental project, I guess, called Vulnrichment. So CIS is like, hey, we're going to try and pipe data into the CVE program so that you get CVSS scores, you get some CWE, you get these new thing called stakeholder specific vulnerability categorization decision nodes.
Yeah.
And you're going to get some CPE. And we're all like, oh, that's great. So like, you guys are coordinating to help fill this gap. And that project has been successful. I think I'm the second largest non-government contributor to that project, mostly like providing feedback.
Who's the first?
Like Jake Baines, our CTO, right? So we're always like, dude, we love these public projects and we always want to contribute back. We always want them to get better because ultimately, like, the more public goods that have good quality stuff, it's better downstream for everyone, including someone like ourselves, which commercializes data. And so, that's just a reality is like, how much can we contribute, help provide feedback? I think later in the year, CISA then was like, this CPE stuff is hard, and a lot of people might not know what CPE is. It's gosh, I forget what
It's a common platform enumeration.
enumeration. Yeah, sorry,
With
common
the,
platform enumeration. But
yeah,
essentially, that's how most security products historically have associated a vendor software version with a vulnerability, right? So that's a very important um, thing. And so when NIST stopped doing it, then it's like, okay, so this is going to start doing it. And then December, they're like, the CPE stuff is too hard. We're just going to stop doing it.
can I say something?
Yeah, go
This
ahead.
the CPE thing was only relevant to non-VM vendors because the VM vendors had their own way of fingerprinting applications and so on. So they never cared about.
Some,
So
yeah,
places I've been at, like the Tenables and the call, we never cared about CPE because
yes.
CPE was good if you were a new vendor in VM and you didn't know how to catalog an application or a server or a hardware. CPE was like a very quick way. We get a CPE and you get the one DB, you can put them together. Look, I have a VM solution. But you know what I mean?
No, you're completely right. Like on the detection side, right? Like a Tenable or a Qualys have
Exactly.
proprietary processes and how they process their information. But the 100 other products out there in the VM space
They
are
had no way
relying
to
on
do it.
CPE.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They had to rely on CPE.
And so I think that like that was kind of a reality of one of the things we saw early on. And actually, when NIST made their announcement, that was the number one thing we identified as a company that we could provide value back to the community on was CPE. It wasn't CVSS scores, it wasn't CWE. It's like, man, so many tools that people are using rely on CPE for detection that like it's bad for the industry if there's no CPE. And so naturally, we internally, very quickly, led by Jake Baines, our CTO, as I mentioned, one of the contributors back to Vulnrichment, we're like, how quickly can we provide high fidelity, high quality automated CPE? Because most of the CPE you see today that is through NIST NVD is manually generated through analysts. And we know with the explosion of vulnerabilities that just doesn't scale.
Mm.
In we there are some pieces of CPE that we do commercialize, but largely we decided to take the CPE that we generate and provide it as a free service. In Vulncheck, I think it's called NVD plus plus, which is like NIST NVD delivered reliably with those enrichments. And so kind of interesting, like us being opportunistic of like, hey, here's an opportunity to help. But ultimately, it's like it's still not good that like these government entities aren't doing it, because there's a lot to cover. Is the real reality, and then kind of fast forward to 2025. So then we had VulnCon, and VulnCon is like the CVE's programs conference.
Yeah.
And that happened last year. NIST kind of did a little bit of lip service, I would say, and said the same exact thing they said the same before. Don't worry about it. We're automating everything. I think the year before they talked about a consortium with the industry, and then they never did it. And I'm not trying to point fingers. It's just like the communication is all over the place, right?
Mm.
And this has real world implications to defenders, vulnerability management teams, everyone. Like everyone is impacted, right? From a security perspective. So it has real world implications. Um, and so the consortium never happened, 2025, kind of same thing. But like a week after VulnCon, suddenly like the board members from CVE dropped some news that tomorrow CVE is no longer going to be funded. CISA didn't sign the contract, and boom, next crisis. So, naturally, I'm not trying to be critical of these things, but like systemic crisis across multiple administrations of challenges within government of like, what do consumers expect? And so I think there's been a pretty quick narrative shift as well of like, well, we never designed this for like global use. This was just designed for federal
I
scope
don't.
as we're going down this path. And so I think like that's something just a lot of people reality have had to process and figure out like, what am I going to do? How am I going to address gaps potentially from a tooling perspective? If I'm building a product security tooling, what do I do if there isn't the information that's needed? You know, and so it creates a bunch of these problems. But ultimately, the funding, they were like, "Oh, we got an 11-month extension. Don't worry about it." And so I think generally like this continued like domino of government services. I'm not trying to criticize them all. I know they're doing great work. They're in challenging positions, right?
Mm.
But it does make it hard for a lot of organizations to put trust in something that has essentially degraded over time, and the message around it hasn't been exactly like, maybe people had well intentions and they thought they were being transparent, but if you're going to say stuff publicly, like deliver on it,
And and I
is a
read,
big lesson there.
and then one of the things that I read was there were 36,000 or 37,000 vulnerabilities that were not enriched or something on those lines, and then they came back with a report that 32,000 of them are not scheduled to be enriched anymore. So the
Yeah.
outstanding count is like just 4,000. So
Well,
magically, that entire backlog disappeared. Oh, we just
yeah.
have 2,000 issues to take care of, and these 32,000 or whatever that number is not scheduled or something on those lines.
Yeah. And I don't think it's bad. Like, I think they're being more transparent, at least, of like, hey, look, we told you we're going to get to the backlog. We're really not. And here's how we're going to communicate. We're not.
Yeah.
And so at this year at VulnCon 2026, the conversation is a bit more transparent, but also like you already eroded trust, right?
Yeah.
For a while. And so generally it's like, hey, look, like we don't have the analysts and people capacity to do the work we used to do, and the backlog continues to grow. So we're just going to make a conscious decision rather than marking old things as deferred or not marking anything on new things and letting it sit in a queue, where we're going to use this term not scheduled, which I think at least is like a good thing for people like myself that have to understand like government ain't touching this.
Yeah.
But ultimately it's like continuing, to analyze what is the impact of the things that they say and the announcements they're making. And really the criteria, I think the criteria is great to start with, which is we're going to make sure that KEVs are enriched first. Makes complete logic sense. I actually reached out to them and said, hey, you should use our Vulncheck KEV to like prioritize things in addition to CISA. But then they said, hey, and then things in the federal scope, which is incredibly vague. And I think to me, what this is like, okay, they can make an excuse however they want.
Yeah.
There really isn't any accountability in the model, because essentially they can make a determination whether they want to analyze it or not. I think in good faith, they are gonna focus on things that are gonna be much more pervasive, much US centric. But when I talk about people throughout the world that were leveraging and using this service globally, they're like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to leverage and use it how we historically have, because they're just so focused on a single scope, and they're limiting it, and there's no guarantee that things are going to get covered. And so naturally, I think reaction wise, I think that's fair. I think it's good there's more transparency, but also like even a week later, it's like things are in flux. Like the website is updating, but the API data isn't. Yeah, this is pretty normal. So we're kind of going through a phase of trying to learn, what there is and isn't going to be out of the data moving forward. But I do think ultimately it's going to provide everyone with a lot more transparency around like what is going to get coverage, what's going to get enrichment quick and fast.
Yeah. Because
And then what things aren't, and it's going to be, the responsibility of the private sector to fill the gaps.
it reminds me of my product management days where, as a product leader, you get a lot of feature requests coming in, right? And you have a lot of feature requests, customers are waiting on feature requests. And if you don't classify the feature request, then the customers get angry. Hey, what happened to my feature request? So one of the things I did in my previous job was not on roadmap. So it
Yeah,
was very clear,
yeah,
not on roadmap. You're never going
yeah,
to do this feature. So there was some closure there was some closure for the future. So I think not scheduled is at least some level of closure
Yeah.
for everybody, that we are not going to do this. If you find other ways to do it, go for it. We're not going to, we're not going to touch it. And then, but these 4,000 maybe will do something. The other thing I want to talk about is you or your team got involved in this, especially with this hype around mythos and exploitation and so on and so forth. Your team or your product got involved with the zero-day clock project, right? The zero-day clock project, and one of the core arguments of that project is the time to exploitation has essentially gone down from years to hours, and it is projected to go down to minutes with AI. I'm curious what your take is on that in terms of the rate of exploitation going down. That is one. Second is, do you have a differing point of view on how the data was represented?
So really two things. First off, the 0-day clock, right? Great project. I think it drives awareness of things are moving faster, quicker. There are a lot of different ways you can calculate data in charts and graphs like that. So I don't think the discrepancies of like, is it hours, is it days, is it a month? I think no one would agree it has shrunk substantially from where it was at a couple of years ago as far as how quick people are moving. And I really, if you look at the timeline and how fast people are moving, like when I look at it, we're probably somewhere around an average. And average is like, or median, or however you want to calculate it. There's so many discrepancies with that. But the reality is a lot of vulnerabilities are getting exploited before they're even disclosed, right?
In-
I think somewhere around 26% that I calculated of vulnerabilities with exploitation evidence for the first time publicly were the disclosure of the exploitation evidence was on the same day or prior to the vulnerability being disclosed. So those are things that you don't have visibility into, and you don't even have a patch to fix it. So mitigating controls are particularly important in those cases. Um, and so what that says is yeah, there's a lot of vulnerabilities, 0 days. Threat actors are finding ways in and being opportunistic. There's also a long tail of vulnerabilities that are what I would equate to be legacy vulnerability debt, where there might be a vulnerability that sits around for 4 years and then starts getting exploited suddenly. And so the time windows can really, vary, but what we're seeing now is the ability for just about anyone to develop an exploit with AI tools.
Hmm.
So I'd say in the last 6 to 12 months, now discovery of vulnerabilities and the ability to exploit them, like a much broader set of people can leverage those capabilities, but people that already know how to do it can accelerate the ability to develop new 0 days with these tools. Um, and exploit faster, quicker. And so, if anything we're seeing from like the Anthropic, Claude, OpenAI tooling side of things, and we manage a report of vulnerability service. So we're seeing this firsthand. At first, it was a bunch of slop where people were just submitting reports and the vulnerabilities weren't real.
Hmm.
Very quickly, that has transitioned to a high volume of real vulnerabilities being reported that have to
Interesting.
go through vulnerability disclosure process, have to get fixed, have to get a patch, and then people have to go apply that patch once it actually gets disclosed. And so just nature of the beast, like this is coming faster, quicker, both on the exploitation side, but then on the vulnerability discovery side. And what that means is like it is going to be way more information moving forward, probably at levels that people aren't used to processing, especially if you're on a product security team where you're maintaining a tool, a software, open source software, any of these different things.
And what do you think?
Um,
What do you think is happening? Why do you think the time to exploitation is going down? Because are you seeing evidence that these AI models are contributing to the speed of exploitation getting sped up, or is there is something else happening
so
for time for exploitation coming down?
yeah, I wouldn't correlate it necessarily with the AI models. Like this has been
That's yeah.
happening for 2 or 3 years, right? Where it really is accelerated. I really think the attackers just shifted from credential compromise to exploitation,
Mm,
and a lot of them are getting really good at it, or were really good at it. And so naturally, more people are using that from a tactic perspective, which is going to accelerate the timeline because that's where they're spending their time.
Mm,
From a resource perspective, not saying that credential compromise still isn't a problem, but the it's hard. And if you start implementing things like FIDO U2F, it's substantially harder. And so naturally, now I shift my resources towards exploitation of vulnerabilities. Those timelines are all going to accelerate. And what I've seen on the reverse engineering side is a lot of times these researchers on the research side or on the bad guy side, threat actors, um, they focus on a certain product. Maybe they focus on file transfer products. Maybe
mm,
they focus on network edge devices, and they just kind of fixate on that, and they're able to go find bugs that they can exploit, and then they go after it. I mean, they're not reporting those, of course, to the vendors. And so a lot of times the vendor might learn about a vulnerability for the first time when it's getting exploited.
I see.
And then they have to go fix and release a patch, and then everyone else finds out about it if there isn't like a mass exploitation of that. Now, what's interesting there is a little bit of tangent. I know we're talking about a lot of things here, but in Europe, the new Cyber Resilience Act actually requires vulnerabilities to disclose exploitation of vulnerabilities within, I think it's 24 hours of it happening. So naturally, circling full back, this should contribute to more disclosures of exploitation events in the wild, which I think is going to be good for everybody. Yeah, anybody doing business in Europe under the CRA has to disclose exploitation evidence to the European entities like the CSIRTs, and if they don't comply with that, there's like 2 to 6% fines. I might be wrong with that range of total revenue. So the once we kind of circle back to compliance, but like now in Europe, this is being driven as a compliance vehicle, and the large majority of like tech companies do business in Europe. So
Interesting.
they're gonna have to comply with that. That starts September 2026. They have to start reporting. So
What do you think happens to the future of CISA KEV? You've identified all these loopholes in the CISA KEV. It's only focused on the federal side. It's not focused on the European or Asian markets and so on and so forth. They don't have the full scope, and then vendors like one check come in, fill the gap. And my sense is we are used to using these crutches like CVSS, EPSS, CISA KEV as a proxy for exploitation, and that will, at least this is my sense, will not be relevant in the future. The thing that will matter is this exploitable by AI or is it not exploitable by AI? Or in the
yeah,
sense of,
it's early. It's early. So I don't disagree with you. I think that's going to be a factor. And we already have companies that do like reachability analysis.
Mm,
Is a good example, kind of like, looking at the AI aspect. I think AI, is it exploitable, is different. But ultimately, yeah, you definitely want to focus on the things that the threat actors are using if you have that information. And so this is probably more like a Metasploit module where like, yeah, if you know an AI model can exploit it, it's the new bar is essentially like, can AI exploit it? I think is a fair bar. Similar to like, is there a Metasploit module that's been weaponized and we know that it works?
exactly.
It doesn't mean it's gonna get used, but it probably is. And so
Especially by the
yeah, I think
leading, yeah. There are some companies that are very cutting edge in terms of their vulnerability management processes. They're at the top of their game. Maybe they will use it, but there is a long tail of organizations that are still fixing log for shell. Even
yes.
even
Yeah.
even now you run a scan and you find log for shell in these organizations. The follow up question I had is uh, what happens to the future of exploitation? Is it and you briefly mentioned you're seeing a lot of AI slop, or at least you were seeing a lot of AI slop early on. Do you still see that kind of um, a slop in your day-to-day work right now?
We still see some, but what we're seeing is a shift where the stuff that the AI tools are using, whether they're using Claude or OpenAI or whatever AI tool they're using, like they're getting better. And the
Right.
reports tend to be more accurate. And when we report these things that are reported to us, to the software supplier, most of them are ending up being real or legitimate. In some cases, not. And so I think validation and verification becomes a very important step at scale. But I do think that a lot of these product teams and software teams need to realize that AI is going to find a lot more vulnerabilities that were in your software that just weren't discovered. And
Yeah.
so naturally that's going to create a similar experience to when fuzzing tooling came about, right? Where people all of a sudden were like, wow, look at all these things. I need to go fix them now. Um, I just think the reality is it's at a very accelerated rate. It's faster, quicker. And I think Firefox is probably the best example we have with Anthropic Glasswing. One of the areas I've been spending a lot of time and research on. It's like, yeah, this Anthropic thing is real. It found 300 vulnerabilities in our software, and we fixed them all. Most teams probably don't have the capacity or skill set to be able to do all those fixes. Now AI could help with that. Like, here's the fixes, here's what you want to change. But like this is a complete shift in how you develop software.
Yeah.
And it's gonna change the game for everyone out there as far as how they might approach security from a software standpoint. So I think, I'm super careful of like, I think a lot of this is marketing talk, like marketed campaign from Anthropic and Glasswing, but at the same time, it's like, hey, yeah, it's going to find a lot more new findings that you didn't know.
Right.
And naturally, you can expect any of this tooling to end up in the threat actor's hands. Like any tool that you have access to, creatively, a threat actor is going to find a way to get access to similar technology, whether that's accessing the same model or just building their own model.
The thing
And that's a reality.
the thing that I don't have a clear line of sight. I mean, I can understand this happening. I can understand this happening to the open source software, which the open basically you connect Claude or some of these frontier models to these open source projects, find these flaws get fixed, and so on. I don't have a clear line of sight on what happens to the commercial software. And, I mean, I don't know if this results into more of trying to take over with the source code of commercial projects, then find the vulnerabilities and then go after them. I don't know if that is a new attack pattern that will emerge from this. The open source is very clear because any open source project that is out there, you should just assume these models will run an assessment on them, especially like the OpenSSL, OpenSSH, Apache Web Server. These should be like by default part of their assessment program. As soon as the new model comes out, there is some level of assessment done and the bugs are fixed. But I don't have a clear line of sight on what happens to the commercial software. Do we see more evidence of stealing commercial software source code to find vulnerabilities and then exploit them?
Yeah,
Oh,
great questions. And then it's like, are you putting the source codes in these models now? And what are the models doing with that source code? Like I know like people are like, oh, it's contained, don't worry about it. But generally what I'm seeing in the space around AI tooling is it's evolving so quickly, and a lot of times it's being released without security in mind. And so I think there's inherent risk with that too, of like leakage of source code, leakage of information. I don't think we need to be like fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and
good
oh, this
enough.
is an
Yeah,
apocalyptic
yeah,
thing.
the industry has done enough of that. We
Uh,
will add to the fear.
yeah, I think it's just the reality of like there's going to be more stuff, more findings, and frankly, the threat actors don't have a problem finding things to target and exploit today. So maybe they can do it faster, quicker, but I don't even think that, like, from my perspective, that like that is going to move the needle substantially from what's already happened. And so maybe this gives the opportunity of defender advantage in that respect more than anything. And that's what I would be hopeful for is these tools have real world impact in relation to the defender and being able to identify and fix these things.
Last question for you, Patrick. You've been looking at vulnerabilities for so many years. Any crazy vulnerabilities come to your mind that you've had like the craziest experience navigating the inception to closure of the vulnerabilities? Any cool stories come to your mind in terms of
Oh man, I wish I had this question earlier because I know there's a ton. On the spot, yeah, I mean, like some of them are funny as far as like, see, if you go through CVE records, you can find all sorts of wild vulnerabilities for different software, hardware,
Were
different
you around
products.
when proxy? You were around when proxy logon happened, right? Oh no.
Yeah. Proxy login on the exchange side. That was the one where the FBI came in and was removing reverse shells off of organizations' exchange servers. So they weren't compromised and they could patch. And so yeah, that was my first real widespread exposure to vulnerability exploitation. And I remember we had a client at that time um that got owned, and we helped from an IR perspective when I was at Blue Mira. And of course I think they were trying to deploy ransomware and other things, but mitigating and containing that and then deploying a new exchange server in order to make sure that they weren't compromised and things were operational. But that and here's the deal, it's like, yeah, as much as you can, hardening, I think if you're a small business, outsourcing to trusted cloud providers is generally a good idea. Not dangling too much of your software out there on the internet if you can't maintain and update it. I think that's a real reality. I'm trying to think of any other real interesting ones. Yeah, I mean, I kind of mentioned the file sharing aspect. And sometimes too, like Crush FTP was a good example of file transferring where they disclosed a vulnerability. We assigned an ID and they got mad at us for just assigning an ID. And so sometimes like people have perceptions of like CVE IDs are a bad thing, whereas in
Yes,
fact, a CVE ID is how people get visibility into vulnerability so they can actually patch and fix.
correct.
Because most people aren't watching your advisories if you're a vendor. Like
Exactly.
some do, large enterprises do, but
You do it
I
for
think
patch.
that's probably
Yeah, you do it for
yeah
patch
that
keys, but nothing else.
yeah, and so that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions is like because someone issues a CVE, they're not the one responsible for what a threat actor does to your product. That's probably the biggest thing I've had to navigate, which is rather interesting. When you're going through it for a first time of like, okay, what's the reality here? But yeah, public disclosure, I think organizations generally have gotten better about it, but there are a lot of companies still that uh, kind of hide their vulnerabilities and they see it as more like public shame. And it's like,
I agree.
no, man, this stuff is really important to get out there so that people actually know to patch, mitigate, and do other things.
Cool, Patrick. This was a fun interview. We covered a lot of ground. You're way too generous with your time. Thank you for your time. What's the next big thing that is dropping from Patrick Garrity?
Man, I mean, for me, a lot like the on the research side, I think the Anthropic stuff I'm tracking closely, trying to understand what vulnerabilities are being disclosed in the products. And so I have a tracker where I'm tracking that, spending a lot of time in analyzing and understanding the implications of NIST MVD and their new statuses and what they're going to tackle. So that's natural. And then I think generally just paying attention to, reported vulnerabilities. If you look at us and you look at GitHub, the substantial spike in CVE issuance and disclosures, some of it's historical work that we've been doing, but by and far the trends are off the chart from a disclosure perspective in the volume. Um, and the reported vulnerabilities that we're seeing. And I think like keeping track of that and ensuring people have the enrichments that are needed to take action and uh, get to what they need. But yeah, generally speaking, it's man, get ready to stay up on the latest updated software, especially for network edge devices, user facing devices, that sort of stuff. And yeah, I mean, I have a lot of fun research ideas, but it is a matter of time.
Good. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mehul. Take care.